I had the privilege of going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 2009 with a good number of parishioners. It was a beautiful experience. Though it has been 15 years since then, I still remember walking into Capernaum. It's on the Sea of Galilee. This small fishing town still has the ruins of the synagogue from tonight's gospel, as well as the foundation of what they believe is Peter's home. As I stood in the ruins of the synagogue, we read tonight's gospel passage. I was overwhelmed by the fact that I could possibly be standing in the very same spot as Jesus himself. I remember being in awe and very humbled. Even now, recalling that moment, I'm overwhelmed with the emotion and the power of that experience. I can still see the place so clearly. The walk to Peter's house was not very far. Again, looking at the foundations, one could see the different rooms and possibly where Peter's mother-in-law lay ill. Again, visualizing the scene, seeing Jesus reach out, grasping her hand and healing her, touched me deeply. Such a simple action, reaching out, grasping her hand with tenderness, compassion, and power. Power to heal, power to make whole. How might you and I need to allow Jesus to approach us this evening? How might we need him to reach out his hand in healing, physically, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, or psychologically? Maybe you feel like Job from our first reading. Is not one's life on earth a drudgery? My life is like the wind. I shall not see happiness again. Maybe you are struggling with a chronic illness. Let Jesus approach you and take your hand. Maybe you are struggling with your teenagers, or maybe you are struggling with your parents as a teenager. Maybe you have to make difficult decisions for an aging parent. Let Jesus approach you and take your hand tonight. Maybe you are stuck in habitual sin that keeps you a slave and you feel the weight of its shame. Let Jesus approach you and take your hand. Maybe you've been struggling with depression or emotional illness, and you are exhausted and feel as if there's little or no hope. Let Jesus approach you and take your hand. Maybe you are struggling with the state of our nation and of the world. Let Jesus approach you and take your hand. Maybe your level of anxiety is so great because of the violence, bloodshed, cruelty, hatred, and anger in our world that you find it difficult to function at times. Let Jesus approach you and take your hand tonight. Or maybe your life like mine, has been so mercifully and overwhelmingly touched by the grasp of Jesus that you know at the very depth of your being that Jesus has got you and will never let go. That assurance for me did not happen all at once, though I know exactly when it began. After having encountered Jesus and the power of the Father's love in the chapel of a Carmelite monastery in the middle of the wilderness in Nova Scotia, my life changed slowly. And through all the ups and downs of my life ever since, often with 2 steps forward and 1 step back, Jesus approached and took my hand. Day by day, year by year, Jesus has never given up on me. He's been there, even though I often could not see it. But he's been there, and he has brought me to this moment, to this place, to this simple witness before you tonight, so that in some small way, my life might speak to you. Let Jesus approach you. Let Jesus grasp your hand. When you come forward tonight to receive him in Holy Communion, and you stretch out your hand or your tongue to receive him, his body and blood, ask for his healing. Ask for his transforming love to overwhelm you. That's all I have. I have no profound message for you this night. However, Jesus does. So let him approach you and grasp you by his hand.
Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. That line from our second reading is in a particular stained glass window in the seminary chapel at Mundelein Seminary near Chicago, where I finished my formation. I spent my last 2 years there. Along the back wall of the chapel, or front wall, I guess, behind the altar, there are 4 stained glass windows, each with a saint that has a special meaning for men who are in formation for the priesthood. So you have Saint Therese of Lisieux, who points us to grow in our spiritual life and deepen our love for Jesus. And St. Thomas Aquinas, the patron saint of students, strengthens us in our studies. And Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati inspires us to go to the heights as virtuous Christian men. But right behind the ambo, which would have been directly in front of me from the place where I always sat in the chapel, about right there. Stan. Right in that window behind the ambo was a stained glass image of St. Paul holding a scroll. And on that scroll, if you walk up close enough to see it, you can read the words, "Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel." So in the course of my last 2 years of seminary, as I began to practice preaching publicly and made final preparations to serve God as an ordained minister, first as a deacon and then a priest, and during that time I was deeply stirred by St. Paul's passion and as an apostle and a pastor. Because if you read his letters, you can't help but hear the urgency in his voice. This is a man who's totally given over his life to Christ. And he just can't shut up about it. How far is he willing to go to preach the gospel? Well, he tells us, "To the weak I became weak to win over the weak. I have become all things to all to save at least some." That's an awfully bold statement. It almost sounds like something Jesus might say. There's a reason for that. It's precisely the point. Paul's whole life has become an imitation or even an extension of Jesus. Paul has let himself be grafted onto the mystery of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. He's let himself be stretched like a canvas so that his whole life will become an image of Jesus to the world. And that's how he preaches the gospel. But if Paul let himself be stretched, it's only because Jesus did this first. Jesus became weak to win over the weak and became all things to all to save at least some of the lost and hopeless souls in this world. We see this in the gospel today. Jesus spends long hours curing the sick and driving out demons late into the night. And he doesn't stop there. He gets up first thing in the morning, nice and early, to go pray. He's stretching himself for our salvation. Jesus, the Son of God for all eternity, hears that helpless and hopeless cry of Job from our first reading. My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle. They come to an end without hope. I shall not see happiness again. Sickness and suffering and death surround us. We're also trapped in the drudgery of sin, which always seems appealing at first, but ends up making life more and more dull. And sin and death thrive on the devil's favorite lie, a lie that could be said in many different ways, but seems to always sound something like, God doesn't love you. God's abandoned you. And the more we find ourselves surrounded by sickness and sin and death, the more we believe this lie and give in to hopelessness. But Jesus enters into this hopelessness to heal us and to give us hope. So what do we see Jesus doing in the gospel? Well, he's just got done preaching in the synagogue in Capernaum, and now he's curing sickness and driving out demons for hours and hours. And it's no coincidence that he gets up early to pray after that late night of work, because he's returning to the love of his Father, that same love that gives him his purpose and identity. He has come to be the presence of his Father's love in the world and to reconcile us to this love. And he does that by preaching and curing and driving out demons. These are all one thing for Jesus. They go together. That's because whenever he's preaching and teaching, he's curing our deepest sickness, which is sin. And he's also casting out the demons that want to keep us stuck in sin. He's healing the wounds that are caused by the devil's lie, and he's teaching us the truth that unravels that lie. What's that? My Father hasn't abandoned you. He's here with you in this pain. I am here with you in your pain, Jesus says. For you who are weak, I became weak. And this is the gospel of his cross. Jesus preaches it all the way to his cross, and most especially on the cross as he gives his life. He's preaching that same gospel, but always pointing ahead in hope to his resurrection and to our hope of new life in him. Now, I'm a pretty weak human, and I often feel stretched pretty thin, worn out and exhausted, and maybe it shows sometimes. I'm sorry. That's mostly my fault, but to some extent, it's just a part of being human. But more importantly, it's a part of being Christian that we stretch ourselves out on that cross so that we can become images of Jesus in this world, like St. Paul, and so that our life can proclaim the gospel of the cross, which is the same gospel as the gospel of hope. If we're letting ourselves be stretched thin, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the reason for that? Is it because we hope in this heavenly glory? Or is it because we're depending on ourselves? Is it so that we can share this hope with our family, our friends, or whoever we stretch out our hand to? Well, today you can let yourself be stretched in hope as you place your bread and wine and your entire life on this altar. You can also stretch yourself out on the altar of the cross. Jesus became all things for all so that he could save at least you and me. With the power of his cross, what will we become for him? Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel.